Imagine a golden mask concealing a family secret so dark it was buried with the king himself. In today's video, we'll uncover the incestuous rituals that kept pharaohs on the throne and the horrific price they paid in twisted bodies and hidden deaths. You'll see jaw-dropping CT scans that expose bone fractures nobody was meant to know about, and hear the scandalous whispers of temple priests who wrote of blood so pure it became a disease. We'll reveal how Cleopatra's desperate power plays almost destroyed her dynasty and the chilling botanical poisons once used in palace intrigues. Stick around to the very end, because the final revelation will rewrite everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt's divine rulers. Beneath scorching desert sands, a beam of sunlight pierced the sealed entrance of a buried chamber. It was as if time itself exhaled, revealing a world untouched for millennia. Gold gleamed from every surface, yet a hush fell over the assembled scholars and laborers. An unspoken question hovered in the hot air. How had this realm of divine heritage turned into a tale of fragile bloodlines and hidden suffering? The buried corridor, its walls slick with ancient pigments, seemed to whisper of rituals born in faith, transformed into rules as unyielding as stone. Those first steps through narrow passageways carried more than torches. They bore witness to a civilization that equated the purity of its ruler's lineage with cosmic order. Each room, stacked with offerings, jewelry, and finely crafted vessels, testified to a belief that kings were children of gods, untouchable, perfect, beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Yet buried in the shadows lay reminders that perfection, when confined within a closed circle, can fracture and erode. As we peer behind those golden doors, the story unfolds like a tapestry woven with threads of myth and power. Picture an early morning gathering of priests, their linen robes crisp, preparing to affirm the sanctity of a new ruler's blood. They stand before generations of lineage charts, connecting mortal flesh to divine bodies. No allowance for unions outside the familial fold. This insistence on inherited divinity demanded a solitude of the womb, siblings marrying, uncles taking sisters as consorts, all in the name of preserving the unbroken chain. Such customs were both sanctified and commanded, echoing through centuries of rituals. But human biology obeys its own laws, indifferent to royal decree. Concealed within temple chambers and recorded in reverent hieroglyphs, the earliest signs of frailty emerged. Statues sculpted with idealized symmetry hid irregularities, slight asymmetries of skulls, slender limbs curved in languid arcs, features that spoke of weaknesses no amount of gold could conceal. In palace halls, whispers circulated about children born with unusual marks or limbs that bent unnaturally. Few dared speak outright, for to question the purity of royal blood was to question the foundation of order itself. Then came the age when art could no longer veil reality. The court of Amenhotep IV, commonly known by the name he adopted in honor of the sun's sole god, shook traditions to their core. Royal artists, once bound by strict conventions, revealed a pharaoh's elongated skull, his slender neck, and delicate features. No longer the chiseled ideal, his visage bore traces of inherited conditions. And yet, these portrayals carried a revolutionary spark. By linking physical divergence to divine favor, they undercut centuries of silent suffering. The realm watched as the image of perfection gave way to a more human likeness. From this moment, the corridor of history curves toward a young king whose story would become the symbol of a civilization's twilight. Placed on the throne as a child, his small body bore evidence of fragility, limbs that required support, an appearance marked by youthful vulnerability. Modern scholars, peering through scanners and genetic analyses, have traced complex syndromes interwoven with microbial invaders, conditions that would have challenged any ruler's strength. Yet he wore his lineage's promise with dignity, his mortuary treasures crafted to reassure both living subjects and eternal companions of his unbroken divine descent. As generations passed, the once glorious practice hardened into an inescapable prison. New dynasties, eager to outshine their predecessors, elevated sibling unions to acts of supreme devotion and unwittingly wove traps of inherited weakness. When foreign alliances threatened borders, pharaohs refused to mend bloodlines with outside houses. Instead, they doubled down on isolation, convinced that even a single outsider's blood could fracture their celestial right. In the end, these choices rendered the kingdom vulnerable. In body and in geopolitics, strength drained away. Yet the desert sands guard more than tombs. They protect the truth until science arrives to unseal the past. Through computed imaging and ancient DNA analysis, researchers have pieced together a portrait contrasting royal afflictions with the sturdier frames of commoners. The very archive of papyri, scrawled with medical observations, gains new clarity when read alongside modern laboratory findings. What was once mythic narrative becomes a cautionary tale. How the pursuit of an untarnished lion led to biological collapse. In the present day, scholars convene beneath neon-lit microscopes, comparing data sets, recalibrating historical timelines, and challenging long-held assumptions. They ask, what lessons can a civilization, governed by an ideology of perfect descent, impart to our complex world where genetic counseling and reproductive ethics stand at the forefront of science? The answer lies not in condemnation of ancient choices, but in understanding how belief, power, and biology intertwine. Seen from the vantage of today, the golden mask that once hollowed these corridors becomes a mirror. It reflects glory and mistake alike, urging modern societies to balance reverence for a heritage with respect for natural limits. As we leave the hushed antechambers, the final chambers open onto a wider horizon, a landscape of learning drawn from the triumphs and missteps of rulers long gone. That horizon beckons with a promise that by listening to ancient echoes, we may write a healthier future. And so our journey begins in that glimmering tomb, moving past gilded walls and silent sarcophagi to reveal the human stories beneath divine veneers. With each step, the narrative deepens, threads of myth woven into medical mystery, of power entwined with vulnerability. No sudden halt awaits instead. Each revelation melds seamlessly with the next, guiding us toward an ultimate understanding, the lesson etched in golden bone, resonant across 3,000 years. As dawnlight filters through narrow slits in temple walls, we imagine priests reciting age-old hymns that equate the pharaoh's lineage with the very craft of creation. Their voices rise and fall in rhythm, invoking the first union of sky and earth, of Horus and Hathor, of siblings whose bond was thought to sustain all life. To these ceremonials, the people gathered below. Farmers, artisans, scribes stood in awe, certain that every syllable reaffirmed the cosmic order. It was never simply poetry, it was law. Underneath the soaring columns, draped in painted lotus and papyrus, the ritual's choreography unfolded with solemn precision. Young princes received ornate collars as their sisters circled in graceful dance, their footsteps stirring the dust, their hands offering symbol-laden vessels of water, oil, and wine. At the ritual's zenith, the touch of their lips, hers to his to hers, was made a public spectacle, sealed by a priest's incantation that claimed to fuse mortal flesh with divine essence. In that charged moment, any outside blood was banished, deemed a threat to the pharaoh's connection with the gods. And so, for centuries, royal families kept to themselves, each generation widening those sacred barriers. But even as silken veils and glittering adornments concealed their private lives, courtly rumors whispered of fragile heirs and mothers who bore children only after months of whispered prayers and secret ceremonies. In niches carved into palace corridors, tiny footprints were traced alongside hieroglyphs praising fertility, or unspoken confession that divine promise sometimes demanded desperate measures. As we follow one princess draped in finely pleated linen, her hair coiled in intricate braids, we glimpse the personal toll. She is expected to wed her own brother, a boy scarcely older than she, and to produce the next bearer of royal blood. Behind her composed smile, there are nights of tears, hands clasped around her womb as she murmurs prayers to Isis, goddess of motherhood. His youth offers no comfort, his slender frame trembles with inherited frailty. Yet their union must proceed, for failure to produce heirs risks unraveling not just a family, but the very fabric of Egypt's stability. The bloodlines, once short on numbers, began to fray. Scribes recorded miscarriages with greater frequency, marking each lost life as both tragedy and portent. Sculptors ever watchful began to soften the features of royal statues, hiding subtle irregularities beneath idealized poses. Walls of hidden rooms bore witness to hushed consultations with court physicians who jotted remedies and recommendations on papyrus scrolls, their reed pens dancing between glyphs of anatomy and flowers of healing. Meanwhile, beyond the palace gates, whispers spread. Common families, growing more secure in their own modest farms, spoke of plagues and blights that no prayers could dispel. They saw shepherds afflicted with clubbed feet as harsh omens. They saw once handsome nobles bowed by spinal curvature, and understood that the gods had grown restless. And yet, despite mounting evidence of a lineage in decline, no decree dared challenge the sanctity of those unions. To do so would be to admit that the divine could err. Tension built like heat above the desert sands, ready to surge. In the inner sanctum of a silent chamber, priests consulted ancient oracles carved into granite, seeking guidance through labyrinthine symbols. Their interpretations varied. Some counseled stricter isolation, convinced that only purer blood could restore balance. Others hinted that alliances beyond the royal house might become a reluctant necessity. But the old guard prevailed. The pharaoh's descent must remain unbroken, his flesh untainted by common blood. It was in this charged atmosphere that the first cracks began to widen, not in walls of stone, but in human bodies. Children born with swollen joints, eyes clouded by cataracts, or speech hindered by underdeveloped jaws were quietly removed from public view. Records, once exhaustive in celebrating triumphs, grew sparse when it came to these fragile lives. Yet traces survive in fragments of correspondence, in the scrawled notes of physicians, in the half-finished reliefs that hint at suffering instead of glory. The golden mask, so often held as emblem of undying perfection, concealed more than a king's likeness. It hid the consequences of an ideology that elevated blood above all else. And as we edge closer toward the reign of a pharaoh who would dare to challenge these conventions, we sense the coming upheaval, a point where image and reality would collide, forcing an empire to confront the price of its own myths. As the sun climbed higher, the very air of Thebes seemed to shift, charged by a restlessness that had long been simmering beneath royal decrees and priestly chants. Within the inner quarters of the palace, artists, once compelled to carve idealized silhouettes of muscle and symmetry, now found themselves guided by a new vision. They watched as their sovereign, whose visage bore an elongated skull, gently sloping shoulders, and a slight lilt in his gait, stepped onto the polished stone floor. No longer did they hide those traits beneath perfected forms. Instead, they began to celebrate them, aligning the pharaoh's distinctive features with a divine transformation of Egypt's faith. In murals across the palace walls, the contours of his face emerged in bold relief: eyes large and contemplative, lips full, body slender yet dignified. Sun discs with outstretched rays crowned his head, each ray ending in a tiny hand offering the sign of life to the royal family. His queen mirrored these changes, her own slender profile cast in tender scenes of maternal care. Together, they appeared less like distant rulers and more like conduits of a new, singular devotion to the Aten, the sun's golden disk, whose warming light would replace the pantheon of old gods. The court's mood oscillated between reverence and confusion. High priests of Amen, guardians of a long-established hierarchy, muttered in shadowed corridors. Temple stewards found their roles appended. Idols of familiar gods were shuttered behind locked sanctuaries as decrees prohibited their worship. Yet crowds gathered in open courtyards to witness the daily ritual of the sun's passage, where alabaster altars gleamed with offerings of libations and fragrant oils. Ordinary Egyptians, whose lives depended on the Nile's rhythms more than on celestial politics, looked on with curiosity marbled by concern. Could a single god truly hold sway over the flux of floodwaters and harvests? Meanwhile, the intimate bond between pharaoh and queen became a public emblem of this new dawn. On solemn mornings, she would cradle their daughters, her own offspring, beneath the nurturing rays of the Aten, Her arms curved protectively, even as she stood in a sculptor's spotlight. Their soft laughter, immortalized in frescoes, carried a quiet defiance. It said, "Here is life, fragile yet enduring, carried forward by love rather than forced bloodlines." Those images spread, emboldening whispers that perhaps the old laws of endless sibling unions could be reconsidered. Yet beneath the hopeful glow lay unspoken tensions. The aged vizier, whose family had served long ago the god Amen, scrawled urgent appeals in hidden chambers, cautioning that uprooting centuries of tradition could unleash chaos. He warned of nobles, whose power derived from temple patronage, should the priests fall silent. Their influence and the stability it propped might crumble. But the pharaoh, convinced of his divine mandate, pressed on. He envisioned an Egypt renewed, cleansed of archaic restrictions, guided by the unifying warmth of the sun's single presence. Artisans adapted quickly, blending the new aesthetic with whispers of the old. Stone carvers left subtle echoes of familiar symbols, a crowning sun disk interwoven with a faint anchor so as to soothe anxious minds. Craftsmen who once sculpted stoic lions now portrayed them with elongated limbs, as if basking in an otherworldly light. Even in the palace gardens, statues of falcons and ibis were repositioned to face east, greeting the dawn as they once faced the horizon in silent obedience. Beyond courtly life, the common populace wrestled with small yet telling signs of change. Weavers in merchant quarters dyed linen in paler yellows and golds instead of deep blues and reds. Bakers sculpted loaves with sunburst patterns, while street vendors offered small clay discs stamped with the king's profile. These quotidian adaptations whispered that the revolution was not merely theological or artistic, but woven into the very fabric of daily existence. And yet the deeper void remained. The royal bloodline, despite its renewed symbolism, still carried the weight of generations. While the arts celebrated transformation, the bodies of those who had borne the lineage showed no sign of miraculous healing. Under candlelit examinations, court physicians still noted slight curvature of the spine, subtle malformations of the joints, reminders that genetics heeded neither decree nor devotion. In secret journals, some doctors proposed alliances outside the royal fold, speculating that introducing fresh blood might strengthen future heirs. But such ideas remained confined to dusty scrolls, written in code, lest they draw the wrath of jealous power. Thus, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. One path led toward a new theology that honored difference as divine expression. The other beckoned to unthinkable change, the blood that had bound rulers for centuries. Through every glimmering corridor and painted hall, the question pressed onward, unfurling like a scroll before the eyes of all Egypt. Could a society so deeply rooted in sacred lineage find the courage to circumvent its own biological inheritance? Or would it remain entrapped by the very purity it once held so dear? In that moment, as the pharaoh's golden arms reached heavenward and the Aten's rays danced across alabaster reliefs, the age-old tapestry of power and faith began to unravel, and at its edges lay the faint outlines of a future, yet unwritten one, where tradition and transformation would collide in a struggle that echoed far beyond the palace gates, toward every hearth and field of the Nile Valley. The story was no longer confined to whispered corridors of the elite. It surged outward, carried by every sunbeam, every carved statue, and every soul pondering what lay beyond the gilded mask. As the wheel of history turned once more, a slender youth found himself bearing the weight of the sun disk's promise. Barely 9 seasons old, he was ushered into halls lined with the echoes of past glories and the muted groans of centuries-old expectations. His attendants draped him in garments woven from the finest flax, their hands trembling as they adjusted the ceremonial collars that proclaimed him both scion and savior of Egypt. Yet behind the painted calm of his face, there lay a fragile frame, limbs slender as papyrus reeds, a gait that required unseen support, and a heart that fluttered with the strain of inherited ailments. In those first weeks of his reign, counselors and regents moved like figures in a delicate dance around the boy king, each maneuver intended to shield him from the harsh glare of power. Festivities marked his accession, processions of gleaming chariots, offerings laid at the temple steps, and the rhythmic beat of drums heralding his divine descent. But in private chambers, court physicians examined him by flickering lamplight, noting a curvature of the spine that made him stoop slightly, joints that resisted full extension, and a bloodline weighed down by generations of close kinship. Their meticulous scrolls spoke of complex patterns, perhaps a congenital condition compounded by cycles of restricted alliances, perhaps a vulnerability to infections that lurked unseen in the air and water. Despite these challenges, the young sovereign carried himself with an elegance beyond his years. In reliefs, he is shown with an almost ethereal grace, reaching out to nurture the flocks upon which Egypt depended, guiding farmers along the riverbanks in visions etched upon limestone. His smile, immortalized in gilded statuary, spoke of hope, a fleeting warmth that promised renewal. Yet beneath those tender portrayals lay an undercurrent of tension. Each breath he took was a reminder that royal privilege could not rewrite the code of the body, and each public appearance risked revealing the frailty that even the most skilled artisans could not conceal. Centuries later, when modern minds turned their instruments toward his remains, they uncovered truths as compelling as any hieroglyph. High-resolution scans revealed multiple fractures, some healed, others likely sustained in the tumult of youth, alongside evidence of blood disorders that would have taxed even the strongest constitution. DNA fragments whispered of genetic threads unraveled by centuries of repetition, of vulnerabilities passed like hidden burdens from one generation to the next. And yet, in those scientific revelations, there was also a story of endurance, of a boy who ascended to power and, despite every obstacle, left a legacy more enduring than many who had come before him. In the silent chambers where his coffin rests, where once the scent of incense lingered amidst shadows of flickering flames, one can almost hear the echoes of a life lived between worlds, the divine and the mortal, the ideal and the real. His funerary treasures, brimming with symbols of rebirth and protection, were meant to guide him safely into the beyond. Yet they also stand as a testament to the realm he inherited, a civilization at once majestic and vulnerable, bound by sacred tradition, irrevocably shaped by the truths of human biology. And as those truths emerge from the dust of ages, they invite us to reflect on the fragile interplay between ancestry and identity, power and mortality, an interplay that, like the Nile itself, continues to flow through the heart of human experience. Emerging from the tombs of the New Kingdom, the lineage of pharaohs had grown weary, their bodies bearing the imprint of centuries-long isolation. Yet the river's current carried whispers of new powers, from the rising might of Macedon to the sprawling ambitions of Rome. In Alexandria's sunlit courts, descendants of Alexander sought to weave Greek traditions into the tapestry of Egyptian rule, inaugurating the Ptolemaic line with hopes of revitalizing the throne. Brothers and sisters still married, their unions sanctified by both Greek custom and Egyptian ritual. Yet now they navigated a tighter web of politics, alliances with foreign generals, rivalries among Hellenistic elites, and the ever-present gaze of Rome's senators. Among them stood Cleopatra, the last scion of a dynasty that clung to ancient ideals even as the world around her transformed. Fluent in multiple tongues, schooled in Greek philosophy and Egyptian theology alike, she wielded her heritage as both shield and spear. In portraits she appears adorned with the uraeus and diadem, yet her gaze holds the spark of strategy, a queen who courted Roman statesmen, not simply for power, but perhaps in search of the fresh blood that might spare her heirs the burden of inbred frailty. Her alliances, first with a triumvirate of Rome's earliest coalition, and later with its most celebrated general, carried echoes of defiance against the conventions that had bound her house for millennia. But even as Cleopatra navigated palatial corridors and sailed down the Nile in gilded barges, the spectre of genetic isolation lingered. Her children, portrayed in coins and reliefs, bore hints of the family's legacy, subtle facial asymmetries, delicate frames, features that spoke of both Hellenistic refinement and ancient Egyptian descent. In private consultations, court physicians devised regimens of diet, elixirs, and ritual baths striving to fortify their bodies against inherited weaknesses. These efforts, however, could only partially counteract the deep-rooted patterns of ancestry. With the fall of Alexandria and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman sphere, the era of sibling marriages collapsed under the weight of external rule. The sacred kem, once the very foundation of a god-king's legitimacy, gave way to governors, procurators, and legions. Yet the lessons of those dynasties did not vanish. They lived on in the scrolls, preserved by scribes, and in the vaults of temples gradually repurposed for imperial cults. The age of pharaohs had ended, but the story of their blood carried forward into science's awakening. Centuries later, archaeologists unsealed tombs long sealed by desert sands and shifting dynasties. Under fluorescent lights rather than torchlight, researchers catalogue skeletal remains, noting pathologies that had once been consigned to myth. CT scans revealed spinal curvatures, cranial deformations, signs of healed fractures, silent testimonies to inbreeding's toll. Ancient DNA, extracted from tooth pulp and bone marrow, traced lineages with remarkable precision, confirming what hieroglyphs had only hinted: a dynastic loop that, generation after generation, compounded both divine claim and biological cost. Collaboration between geneticists, anthropologists, and historians forged a new narrative, one that transcended the simplistic view of pharaohs as omnipotent deities. Instead, they emerged as mortals wrestling with the laws of nature, whose attempts to defy heredity resulted in unintended consequences. Conferences celebrated these interdisciplinary insights, drawing parallels between ancient practices and today's debates in genetic counseling, ethical breeding, and the management of hereditary disorders. The golden mask became more than an artifact. It was a catalyst for reflection on how societies construct ideals of purity and perfection. In modern laboratories, algorithms sift through genomic data from aristocratic mummies and ordinary Egyptians alike, revealing stark contrasts. While royals manifest a higher frequency of recessive conditions, the broader population connected by more diverse unions exhibits resilience, shaped by genetic plurality. Papyrus fragments describing remedies for inherited afflictions gain newfound significance when mapped against gene variant databases, and as museums display artifacts once reserved for elites, virtual reconstructions allow viewers worldwide to glimpse both the grandeur and the vulnerability of those who governed by divine right. Thus, the saga that began in sunlit tombs echoes through the ages, offering a mirror to our own epoch. It prompts us to question how we balance respect for tradition with the imperatives of health and diversity, how we honor heritage without repeating its mistakes. In that balance lies a lesson as vital as the river Nile itself, that the strength of a people flows not from the purity of a single line, but from the mosaic of many lives, converging in shared humanity. As the Nile's cycles continue to nourish the land, the story of Egypt's rulers remains a testament to the delicate balance between ideology and biology. The pharaohs strove to embody divinity through unbroken bloodlines, yet their quest for purity unwittingly bred vulnerability. Today, genetic counselors guide families toward healthy unions by embracing diversity rather than isolation, an approach that might have saved generations of royal heirs from silent suffering. Across disciplines, scholars draw from ancient papyri and modern data alike. Medical historians reference case studies from mummified remains to illustrate how recessive traits accumulate under closed inheritance systems, cautioning contemporary societies against repeating similar mistakes. Anthropologists spotlight how cultural values shaped marriage practices in antiquity, reminding us that tradition can both sustain and subvert collective well-being. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, once a symbol of perfection veiled in secrecy, now serves as an emblem of transparency. Its gleaming surface invites viewers to look beyond surface beauty and contemplate the human vulnerabilities it conceals. Museums worldwide present interactive exhibits that juxtapose ornate funerary treasures with CT images of collapsed spines and cranial anomalies, encouraging visitors to engage with the full spectrum of human experience from triumph to frailty. In classrooms and conference halls, ethicists probe questions first posed millennia ago. How far should we go to preserve perceived purity? What are the moral limits of intervening in natural inheritance? And as gene editing technologies advance, these debates gain newfound urgency. The ancients' fixation on untainted lineage warns us against hubris, while their reverence for life challenges us to wield our growing scientific power with humility and foresight. Ultimately, the legacy of Egypt's divine kings is neither a celebration of unchallenged authority or a horror story of genetic decay, but a nuanced chronicle of human ambition and its biological consequences. It reminds us that every culture weaves its own tapestry of beliefs, and that the threads we choose will determine whether that tapestry endures strong, vibrant, and inclusive or unravels under the weight of its own dogmas. As the sun sets over the desert plateau, the whisper of ancient chants merges with the hum of modern laboratories. Between those echoes and that buzz lies the lesson of 3,000 years. True strength emerges when we honor our past, embrace our shared humanity, and recognize that the richest legacy is not a flawless line of descent, but the diverse mosaic of lives united by a common destiny. Under the bright glare of modern floodlights, teams of archaeologists and geneticists descend into newly uncovered shavstones untouched since their sealing more than 3 millennia ago. Their countdown begins with dust motes dancing in pools of lamplight, each grain a silent witness to centuries of buried secrets. As the first chamber door creaks open, cameras roll and screens flicker, transmitting the moment when gypsum plaster gives way to intact painted reliefs. The carvings here differ from the grand portraits in Luxor. Figures are smaller, less formal, their flesh etched with realism, a sign, perhaps, that even in earlier eras some artisans dared to record life unvarnished. Specialists clad in gloves and masks move with precision. Radiologists wheel portable CT scanners along narrow corridors, positioning them against stone sarcophagi carved with double uraei. Inside, slender bone structures emerge in three-dimensional reconstructions on laptops, vertebrae fused unevenly, tiny fissures running like fault lines through cranial vaults. Meanwhile, a team at the adjacent makeshift lab extracts minuscule samples of dental pulp, initiating protocols to sequence mitochondrial DNA. Each pipette shake, each centrifuge spin, carries the promise of filling gaps in the genealogical record linking Pharaoh to predecessor in a genetic chain, once accessible only through myth. Every scan and sequence feeds into a growing database where algorithms trace inheritance patterns across dynasties. Here, lines on a screen become more than colored bars. They chart the slow accumulation of recessive mutations that medieval scribes could not name, but evidently documented as harbingers of decline. When bioinformaticians overlay these genetic insights on timelines of crumbling temple walls and shifting capital cities, a broader picture unfolds. Periods of political upheaval often coincide with generations where the genomic load peaked. Such correlations do not imply simple causation. Environmental stressors, economic pressures, foreign incursions all played roles, but they sharpen our understanding of how biology and power intersect. At the University of Cairo's genetics department, a researcher pores over annotated papyrus fragments that describe mysterious illnesses of noble flesh. Ancient remedies ointments smeared from date palm extracts, poultices of crocodile fat and frankincense are tested in parallel with modern pharmacology to assess any real biological activity. Early results suggest that some compounds contained mild anti-inflammatory properties, offering temporary relief for joint pain, yet they could not counteract the underlying cranial and skeletal anomalies encoded in royal DNA. In seminars, these findings spark heated debate. Were priests complicit in concealing hereditary disorders, or did they genuinely believe in the curative power of ritual medicine? The answer, like so much in Egyptology, lies buried beneath layers of interpretation. In London's Wellcome Centre, another team employs infrared reflectography and multispectral imaging to read faded notations on temple walls, words barely visible to the naked eye. They uncover references to 2 houses of blood, a phrase that seems to caution future rulers against the perils of incestuous unions. Such inscriptions, long overlooked as poetic flourish, now appear as early warnings embedded in sacred architecture, cross-referencing their locations with nearby reliefs of children born under the sign of fractured stars. Scholars propose that dissent against strict lineage rules emerged from within the priestly class itself. Meanwhile, public engagement initiatives bring these discoveries beyond academic circles. Virtual reality reconstructions allow museum visitors to traverse reconstructed corridors of Amarna, guiding them from the Grand Hall of Aten to a hidden antechamber, where reliefs depict siblings exchanging lotus blossoms. Interactive panels invite users to toggle between idealized artistic conventions and the raw scans of mummified remains, revealing the subtle distortions that artisans once flattened into perfection. Through this immersive experience, audiences grasp not only the splendor of ancient rituals, but also the human costs obscured by gilded masks. As the data landscape expands, interdisciplinary symposia become crucibles for new theories. Anthropologists compare Egyptian practices with analogous systems in other closed royal houses, from the Zhou dynasty in China to Inca lineages in the Andes, probing universal themes of power, purity, and vulnerability. Genetic counselors attend alongside historians, translating lessons from antiquity into guidelines that inform modern reproductive ethics. The convergence of these fields underscores a profound truth. While technology evolves, the fundamental questions remain remarkably consistent. How do societies define legitimacy, and at what biological price? Even in scientific circles, cautionary notes temper enthusiasm. Critics warn against viewing genetic predispositions as destiny. They remind us that environment, nutrition, and social support profoundly shape health outcomes. Indeed, some research indicates that non-royal Egyptians, exposed to harsher labor and poorer diets, often exhibited robust skeletal indicators, strong femurs, healed fractures suggesting resilience born of necessity rather than privilege. This juxtaposition challenges simplistic binaries, elite status conferred wealth and influence, yet that very insulation fostered biological brittleness. By the time the final conference panel concludes, it is clear that the golden legend has cracked wide open. Where once only riddles in hieroglyphs tantalized scholars, now a multidimensional narrative spans imaging labs, genetic archives, and digitized papyri. The legacy of divine kingship, once immune to scrutiny, now lies mapped in codons and carved in stone. And as teams prepare new expeditions targeting overlooked cemeteries and remote desert necropolises, the frontier of knowledge continues to advance, promising ever richer insights into how ancient ambitions shape bodies as well as empires. In the silent corridors of academia and the busy halls of museums, this unfolding story resonates far beyond Egypt's borders. It reminds us that behind every myth and monument stand real lives shaped by the interplay of belief and biology. And as we turn each digital page, we carry forward an ancient lesson, that preserving the integrity of a lineage, whether royal or ordinary, requires more than ritual affirmation. It demands understanding, adaptation, and above all, respect for the intricate fabric of human inheritance. Today, beneath the hum of climate-controlled archives and the glow of computer screens, the echoes of those ancient choices resonate through contemporary discourse. Genetic counselors draw on millennia-old lessons when advising families about inherited risks, emphasizing the strength found in diversity rather than the perils of overly narrow lineages. In clinics from Cairo to Cambridge, practitioners now counsel prospective parents on combining genomes wisely, mindful that history's most powerful families sometimes paid the heaviest price for insisting on untainted descent. Ethicists gather at symposia to debate the boundaries of intervention as gene editing tools grow more precise. How far should we go to eliminate recessive conditions? The Egyptians' experience serves as a powerful cautionary tale, They remind us that preserving a pure line can lead not to triumph, but to gradual decline even when cloaked in divine favor. Today's pioneers in genomic medicine invoke those ancient dynasties when warning against hubris, urging humility before the complex interplay of heredity, environment, and chance. In museum halls, interactive installations encourage visitors to question their assumptions. Behind glass cases, alongside alabaster figurines and gilded funerary masks, digital touchscreens replay CT slices of mummified vertebrae and charts of mutant alleles traced across generations. Users can overlay historical family trees with genetic risk maps, seeing in real time how close unions concentrate certain traits. This immersive experience bridges the gap between past and present, turning spectators into participants, with each choice they make in the simulation illuminating the stakes faced by rulers long gone. Meanwhile, interdisciplinary teams forge new pathways. Historians pore over administrative papyri for references to midwives and mid-pregnancy rituals. Chemists re-examine plant extracts once prescribed for stout hearts or steady limbs, and bioethicists model the societal impact of different reproductive policies. Their work culminates in policy briefs urging governments to support genetic screening programs, promote awareness of carrier status, and ensure equitable access to reproductive technologies. In these recommendations lies a direct thread to the priests and scribes of old, who recorded every royal birth with equal parts reverence and apprehension. As the sun sets over modern cities where skyscrapers mimic the grandeur of pharaonic obelisks, the story of those ancient bloodlines invites a final reflection. No amount of gold or divine decree can rewrite the code that courses through our cells. The greatest lesson from 3,000 years of recorded lineage is that power built on an inflexible notion of purity is bound to fracture. Yet, when we embrace the richness of genetic diversity, combining compassion with cutting-edge science, we honor both our heritage and our capacity for renewal. And so, the legacy of Egypt's divine rulers lives on not only in stone temples and ornate masks, but in every genome sequenced and every conversation about ethical genetics. Their story reminds us that true resilience emerges from openness to new ideas, new alliances, and the shared humanity that underpins all lineages. In that spirit, we turn from gilded corridors toward a future where the tapestry of life is woven from a single thread of blood, but from a vibrant mosaic of many. Beneath the vaulted ceiling of a university auditorium, a hush falls as a keynote speaker takes the stage. She is a geneticist whose family, ordinary farmers from Upper Egypt, once lived in the shadow of royal tombs. In her presentation, mosaics of data unfurl, correlation graphs mapping the frequency of recessive disorders against measures of familial relatedness, time-lapse reconstructions, showing how mutational load crept upward with each closed dynastic generation, case histories juxtaposing pharaonic ailments with modern examples of inherited disease. The audience, comprising physicians, historians, policymakers, and students, leans forward, drawn in by the intricate dance of numbers and narratives. She begins with a story from the Amarna period, recounting how a princess, whose slender wrist bore a faint scar from therapeutic cautery, would sit by a window carved with scenes of the Nile flood. There, she observed the river's renewal, even as her own line seemed to flow toward exhaustion. That image becomes a bridge to today's clinics, where expectant parents pore over pedigrees, weighed down by the prospect of genetic risk yet buoyed by the promise of informed choice. The princess scar, once hidden behind stenciled reliefs, now reminds us that each mark on the body carries a history, and that understanding those histories empowers us to shape healthier futures. From the auditorium, the narrative arcs back across continents and disciplines. In a biotechnology firm in Silicon Valley, engineers refine algorithms that predict carrier status with unprecedented accuracy. These tools, they emphasize, are not meant to narrow the gene pool, but to illuminate paths toward preventative care. Our goal, one researcher explains, is not to engineer perfection, but to preserve resilience. His slides show simulations Communities that embrace genetic diversity enjoy lower incidence of recessive disorders and greater adaptability to environmental changes. He credits his inspiration to a paper on Tutankhamun's lineage, which traced how what once was celebrated as purity became, over centuries, a liability. Meanwhile, on the banks of the Thames, a coalition of ethicists and social scientists debates the social ramifications of germline editing. They frame their discussion with an excerpt from a hieratic text discovered in the dusty archives of Karnak. He who seeks the perfect blood invites the chaos of gods. This admonition, they argue, resonates today as a caution against unchecked genetic modification, should society permit alterations that intentionally or not narrow the spectrum of human variation. The panelists weigh the potential benefits eradicating debilitating conditions against the ethical cost of diminishing our collective genetic tapestry. Across the ocean in Mumbai, community health advocates draw on these debates to design outreach programs in rural villages. Here, the memory of ancient lineages holds less sway than the urgency of preventing thalassemia and sickle cell disease. Counselors visit families, bringing portable sequencers in backpacks and explaining, in local dialects, the meaning of carriers and risks. They tell a version of the Pharaoh's tale. Once, rulers believed isolation sealed their divinity. Today's communities recognize that openness and education protect their vitality. These sessions, held under banyan trees or in bustling market squares, underscore that the lesson of Egypt's past belongs not only to scholars, but to every family confronting genetic uncertainty. In Paris, a permanent museum exhibition titled Bloodlines, From Pharaohs to Families, invites visitors to trace the arc of hereditary knowledge. Dimly lit halls feature glass cases with ancient tools, bronze scalpels, and flint blades alongside 3D printed models of pharaonic skulls. Interactive stations let guests explore how closed unions concentrate gene variants, then choose how they might design a healthy lineage, balancing risk and diversity. As they move through the space, ambient soundscapes weave together temple chants, the hum of sequencers, and the laughter of children, reminding all who pass through that the story of descent is as much about life as it is about history. Back in Egypt, a team of educators develops a curriculum for secondary schools that integrates archaeology and genetics. Students examine replica cartonages, practice decoding hieroglyphs for terms denoting lineage, and conduct mock analyses of mitochondrial haplotypes. They learn that the term often translated as pure in royal inscriptions more accurately meant undiluted in myth rather than unmixed in blood. This linguistic nuance becomes a metaphor for modern understanding purity as narrative coherence, not as a biological imperative. By the end of the module, pupils design their own family trees, mapping traits, discussing ethics, and realizing that diversity is not a threat to identity, but its wellspring. As twilight falls over Luxor's colonnaded temples, a small gathering assembles on the west bank of the Nile. They are a mix of descendants through both blood and vocation of the ancient world, a pharaonic scholar, a molecular biologist, an indigenous healer whose practices draw on plant lore, and a young activist speaking for families affected by rare genetic diseases. By torchlight, they recount the journey from gilded tombs to genome sequencing labs. Their voices echo across the water, weaving together past and present, reminding each other that the core of the story is not tragedy nor triumph alone, but the unbroken thread of humanity's search for meaning in our inherited bonds. In that moment, the river's gentle ripple seems to whisper approval. The ancient Egyptians believed the Nile carried the soul of their nation, renewing life each year. Today, as students, scientists, and citizens stand on its banks, they carry a renewed understanding that every generation inherits more than genes, it inherits choices. And just as the pharaohs once sculpted their legacy in stone, so too do we shape ours in laboratories, classrooms, and communities. This living narrative, stretching from temple walls to digital screens, from royal crypts to village squares, reveals a continuum. It shows how the quest for divinity through blood purity, exorably to vulnerability, and how the modern quest for human flourishing finds its strength in diversity and knowledge. The Ankhs and sun discs of old have given way to maps of the genome and policies of inclusion. But the central lesson endures: no lineage, however exalted, is immune to the laws of nature. It is only by embracing our shared inheritance, celebrating the mosaic of difference, that we secure a future as enduring as the stone monuments left behind by those who came before. Beneath the velvet sky, as the last embers of sunset fade, the story arcs back toward the desert's edge where wine-scoured sands preserve footprints of both chariot wheels and camel caravans. Here, in a remote field beside an abandoned caravanserai, a group of field geneticists has gathered around a cluster of shallow pits. They are testing a novel technique, extracting ancient environmental DNA from sediments to reconstruct the microbiomes that once thrived in royal palaces and common dwellings alike. Their goal is to compare oral and gut flora from elite teams with those of the surrounding populace, seeking clues to how diet, hospitalization rituals, and isolation may have influenced health across social strata. Side by side with geneticists stand cultural anthropologists, mapping oral histories passed down in Nubian and Bedouin families, tales of healers who once treated nobles with mixtures of tamarisk oil and dessert herbs. These narratives, like the papyri and palace reliefs, form strands in the tapestry of knowledge. When scientists identify antimicrobial compounds in residue from royal ointment jars, they cross-reference them against those oral accounts, finding surprising alignments. A remedy whispered by a healer in Siwa Oasis proves to inhibit bacterial growth in lab assays, hinting that isolation was not the only form of seclusion practiced. Noble patients often received more attentive, plant-based therapies than their laboring counterparts. Meanwhile, in a sunlit conference room at Johns Hopkins, a panel convenes to explore the philosophical dimensions of ancestry and identity. Drawing on Egypt's example, they examine modern movements that valorize pure bloodlines, whether in nationalist ideologies or subcultures seeking genetic exclusivity. Panelists warn that these impulses, though cloaked in rhetoric of heritage, echo the same perils that befell dynasties thousands of years ago. A philosopher notes that purity, whether of blood or belief, often requires the erasure of difference, a lesson made stark by the fragmented remains of royal mummies whose genetic tapestries could have been plucked from any number of families across the Nile. On the outskirts of a Nairobi research station, a different kind of gathering unfolds. Conservation biologists studying the genetics of wild cheetah populations draw parallels between their work and the dynastic lineages of pharaohs. Cheetahs, like isolated royal families, suffer from low genetic diversity due to historical bottlenecks. The team uses the Egyptian case study as a rallying cry for broader conservation efforts. Just as intermarriage once imperiled pharaonic health, so too fragmentation of habitat and closed breeding programs jeopardize species survival. In their presentations, they juxtapose images of gilded masks with cheetah skulls, united by signs of genetic drift and vulnerability. Back in Europe, policymakers draft white papers on genomic citizenship, advocating that individuals be empowered with knowledge of their genetic heritage without falling prey to the promises of purity. They emphasize data privacy, ethical handling of genomic information, and the avoidance of stigmatization. Citing the cautionary tale of Egypt's divine kings, the documents argue for frameworks that encourage communal responsibility where decisions about family planning, genetic testing, and therapeutic interventions are guided not by fears of dilution, but by respect for the mosaic of human variation. In Tokyo, a choreography troupe stages a multimedia performance titled Bloodlines and Dust. Dancers clad in shimmering gold fabrics move across a stage street with projections of hieroglyphs and genomic sequences. Their motions evoke the slow, repetitive patterns of ritual, then break into free-form gestures symbolizing the unpredictability of mutation. Between acts, narrators recount vignettes from Egyptian history: a king's weary gait, a princess' hidden tears, the hushed debates of priests confronting failing heirs. The audience, immersed in soundscapes that blended melodies with electronic pulses, experiences the ancient story not as a distant chronicle, but as a living parable of adaptation and resilience. Yet perhaps the most profound continuation of the pharaonic legacy takes place in the labs of the future. Researchers are now experimenting with gene network therapies, not to erase genetic variation, but to bolster the body's natural compensatory pathways. In early trials, patients with rare recessive disorders once deemed inevitable in isolated lineages show promising responses when treated with combinations of gene modulators and lifestyle interventions inspired by ancient Egyptian regimens. Controlled fasting cycles echoing festival fasts, herbal supplements reflecting preserved remedy lists, and meditation practices drawn from reconstructed temple hymns. These holistic protocols underscore a truth gleaned from millennia. Healing demands more than molecular fixes. It requires harmony between body, environment, and culture. As midnight descends over the sands, the eternal river continues its silent flow, carrying within its waters the echoes of endless renewal. The story that began with sibling unions meant to seal divine favor has expanded into a vast continuum stretching from tomb shafts and temple walls to virtual simulations, policy debates, theatrical stages, and cutting-edge clinics. Through every iteration, one constant emerges: the interplay of belief and biology shapes destinies far beyond the confines of any court. And so, the final whisper reaches us. It is not by sealing ourselves within narrow boundaries, be they of blood, culture, or creed, that we secure our future. Rather, by acknowledging the interwoven strands of our shared inheritance, by opening ourselves to dialogue between past and present, science and story, do we find the resilience to thrive. In that convergence of narratives ancient and modern, we glimpse the true legacy of Egypt's divine rulers, not a lineage frozen in gold, but a living mosaic ever renewed by the currents of change. Far beyond the gilded temples and high-security vaults where mummies sleep, the narrative of blood and belief lives on in the hum of a neonatal intensive care unit. Here, tiny patients born with conditions once exclusive to royal lineages lie under warming lamps as clinicians collaborate in real time with geneticists on the other side of the globe. Their families, connected by video link, learn of targeted therapies that draw inspiration from two worlds: the precision of CRISPR-based edits and the holistic regimens catalogued by ancient Egyptian healers. Nurses administer carefully balanced herbal extracts derived from the same dessert plants once ground by temple apothecaries alongside molecular treatments designed to enhance gene networks compromised by recessive variants. In these moments, the lessons of Tutankhamun's tomb and Ptolemaic palaces crystallize into tangible hope. The young king's fragile bones no longer define him. Instead, his story fuels the quest to transform inherited risk into managed resilience. Each breakthrough in gene modulation, each validated botanical compound, knits together past and present, demonstrating that the fissures once sealed behind golden masks can now become gateways to healing. Meanwhile, community forums online and in town halls buzz with conversation. Parents share triumphs. A child who, thanks to early carrier screening, avoided a syndrome that devastated previous generations of vital variants identified in time to adjust prenatal care, a family tree redrawn to enforce isolation, but to celebrate the diversity that underlies human strength. They compare notes on pilot programs, some funded by governments, others by NGOs, that provide free or low-cost genetic counseling in rural areas. In these discussions, the word purity has all but vanished, replaced by resilience, adaptation, and informed choice. Educational platforms host MOOCs, attended by tens of thousands, from students in Cairo to farmers in the Nile Delta, and technologists in Tokyo, where historians and geneticists co-teach modules on heritage and health. Interactive case studies ask learners to balance cultural values with medical ethics. Should a family prioritize faith traditions that value ancestral purity, or adopt guidelines that maximize genetic diversity? As they debate, Participants discover that these dilemmas echo those once faced by priests at Karnak and scribes at Amarna, and by wrestling with them, they honor the complexity of human legacy. At Global Health Symposia, panels feature diverse voices. A pediatrician recounts how lessons from Egyptian mummies informed neonatal screening. An anthropologist discusses how Bedouin tribal records corroborate genetic findings. A policymaker outlines a national strategy to integrate genetic services into primary care. Their presentations conclude with a shared conviction that the story of ancient dynasties is not an academic curiosity, but a blueprint for action, one that urges societies to invest in preventive care, to destigmatize carrier status, and to leverage cultural wisdom alongside cutting-edge science. Even in the realm of art and storytelling, the theme endures. A graphic novel series transports readers to the courts of Amenhotep IV and Cleopatra, interweaving scenes of ritual with sidebars, explaining modern genetic concepts. A documentary film shot on location in Luxor and European labs follows families who, having traced their own lineages, choose paths that blend heritage celebrations with proactive health planning. In theaters and online streams alike, audiences encounter a riveting juxtaposition: the opulence of ancient court life and the intimate struggles of today's families confronting inherited risk. Finally, on the digital frontier, open-source platforms compile anonymized genomic data gleaned from excavated remains and living volunteers. Citizen scientists, enthusiastic laypeople, and professional researchers alike explore these databases to map the trajectory of human variation over millennia. Heat maps reveal hotspots of genetic isolation and diffusion, inviting users to reflect on how migration, conquest, trade, and social taboos shape the distribution of variants across continents and ages. In this sprawling tapestry, the Egyptian example shines as a cautionary thread, but also as an exemplar of how knowledge can transform destiny. And so, as the sun rises once more over the Nile, the river's gentle current carries forward a renewed covenant that ancestry is not destiny, but context, that purity, far from being a pinnacle, can become a snare, and that diversity, when understood and respected, becomes the wellspring of resilience. From the high colonnades of Karnak to the bedside of an infant under a glass dome, from hieratic glyphs to genome browsers, every chapter of this saga underscores a single truth: our shared humanity is built not upon the isolation of lineages, but upon the dynamic interplay of difference. In embracing that interplay, we honor both the struggle and the splendor of those who came before pharaohs and peasants alike, and chart a path toward futures where the brilliance of a golden mask gives way to the glow of collective insight, compassion, and enduring health. As dawn's pale light filters through the latticework of a modern genomics lab, researchers gather around a transparent table strewn with tablets and glass vials. Their conversation drifts effortlessly from allele frequencies to ancient spells, sketching out protocols that marry high-throughput sequencing with time-tested herbal formulations. A bioinformatician taps at her screen, highlighting clusters of genetic variants once deemed anomalies, but now recognized as adaptive responses to harsh desert climates. Her colleague, a specialist in ethnobotany, pores over notes about frankincense-infused salves, proposing a clinical trial to test their anti-inflammatory effects on patients with joint disorders rooted in recessive mutations. In that room, the boundary between past and future dissolves. The same Nile that nourished the harvests of dynasties now sustains data streams and laboratory cultures alike. Farther north, on the steps of a venerable museum, a group of students assembles for a sunrise tour. Their guide, a curator fluent in both hieroglyphs and genomic jargon, leads them past display cases where a child's funerary mask rests beside a touch screen showing that child's mitochondrial haplotype. She points to a series of colored bars indicating levels of inbreeding across centuries and asks, what can we learn from this convergence of art and science? The students reflect on their own family histories, some marked by migration, others by long-standing local roots, and recognize that each lineage carries its own mixture of vulnerabilities and strengths. In that moment, the museum's silent artifacts spring to life, sparking conversations about identity, health, and the responsibilities we inherit along with our DNA. Meanwhile, in remote villages along the Nile's Delta, health workers equipped with portable sequencers and solar-powered centrifuges visit families by bicycle or donkey cart. They explain carrier status not in abstract terms, but through stories drawn from royal annals, how isolation once cloaked the sick in silence, and how today's openness can turn early detection into life-saving intervention. They distribute illustrated pamphlets in Arabic, English, and local dialects, each booklet combining depictions of pharaonic temples with diagrams of chromosomes, so that literacy barriers fade and complex ideas become accessible. Parents study these materials under the shade of date palms, their conversations weaving together threads of tradition and science into a tapestry of practical knowledge. In a sleek conference center in Vienna, delegates debate a draft of global guidelines on genetic data sharing. They propose frameworks that respect individual privacy while enabling the cross-border flow of anonymized information, a vision inspired by the international efforts to decode pharaonic genomes. One delegate reminds the assembly that when samples were first taken from ancient mummies, ethical questions arose. Who owns the genetic material of a culture's ancestors? The room falls silent as they consider the weight of that question, realizing that attitudes shaped by colonial legacies must give way to collaborative stewardship. By the session's end, they've drafted language emphasizing indigenous leadership, community consent, and reciprocal benefits, a testament to lessons learned from both the successes and missteps of past research. On the silver screens of independent cinemas, a new documentary premieres. It intercuts footage of present-day researchers scanning skeletal remains with dramatized scenes of pharaonic court actors in linen kilts whispering secrets of lineage and power. Viewers watch as the film's narrator traces the journey from temple rituals to cutting-edge therapies, interweaving personal testimonies from families who have benefited from advanced screening programs. Tears glisten in the eyes of audience members as they witness a child, once at risk of a life-limiting condition, now running freely through a courtyard, her story echoing the unfulfilled promises once hidden behind golden veils. Yet beyond these high-profile initiatives, change ripples through everyday life. Genetic counseling centers open in cities from Alexandria to Accra, offering services that blend biomedical advice with cultural sensitivity. Counselors learn to speak not only of genes and risk percentages, but also of community values and ancestral narratives. They listen as clients recount folk remedies passed down through generations, tales of desert shrubs that eased fevers or papyrus plasters that soothed wounds, and they seek ways to integrate that knowledge into evidence-based care. In doing so, they forge a model of medicine that honors both the empirical rigor of science and the living wisdom of tradition. Technology companies join the conversation too, developing apps that allow users to track familial traits, receive reminders for carrier tests, and access curated databases of ancient remedies. Users upload family trees alongside genomic data, then explore interactive maps showing how their ancestors migrated along trade routes, mingled with distant populations, and shaped the diversity they carry today. Push notifications offer context. The variant you carry is common in regions once under Ptolemaic rule. Would you like to learn more about how ancient physicians approached related symptoms by blending ancestry education with preventive health guidance? These platforms transform abstract risks into personalized action plans. As the afternoon sun warms the river surface, glinting off motorboats and feluccas alike, a gathering convenes on the west bank near the mortuary temple of Ramesses III. Elders, scholars, artists, and students share stories around a long, low table adorned with papyrus scrolls, tablets, and petri dishes. They speak of heritage and health, of the perils of purity and the promise of plurality, weaving their reflections into a tapestry of shared purpose. When the conversation drifts to the future, they imagine classrooms where children learn both hieroglyphs and genomics, where artists collaborate with bioengineers, and where every citizen sees in their own genome a reflection of humanity's collective journey. As dusk settles and lanterns flicker along the riverbank, the final sentiment crystallizes. The legacy of Egypt's divine rulers, once confined to tombs and myths, now courses through the veins of modern science and society. It reminds us that power founded on exclusivity weakens over time, while strength rooted in openness endures. In that enduring lesson lies our greatest hope, that by embracing the full spectrum of our genetic inheritance, we honor the past, enrich the present, and light the way toward a future where every life, like the Nile itself, flows toward renewal and resilience. As the first light of morning gilds the temple columns, our journey through millennia of lineage, belief, and biology comes full circle. From the sacred unions of pharaohs, cloaked in divine veneer, to the multidisciplinary teams, decoding ancient DNA under clinical floodlights, we have witnessed how the impulse to seal a pure line unwittingly sowed the seeds of vulnerability, and how modern science, grounded in respect for diversity, transforms that cautionary tale into a blueprint for resilience. We began in the hushed corridors of Tutankhamun's tomb, drawn by the radiant mask that both concealed and revealed the fractures of its wearer. We followed sibling marriages sanctified by priests, traced the emergence of genetic collapse in royal crania and bones, and saw artists pivot from idealized symmetry to honest portraiture under Amenhotep IV's reforming gaze. We lingered over the boy king's fragile frame, felt the silent tension of dynasties isolating themselves, and watched as Cleopatra deftly negotiated both blood and politics to stave off decline. In excavation shafts and high-throughput labs, we observed modern pioneers marry CT scans with hieroglyphic clues, translate papyrus prescriptions into pharmacological trials, and draw genetic parallels between pharaohs, nomads, and even endangered wildlife. We stood beside counselors, guiding families toward informed choices, policymakers drafting ethical frameworks, and artists weaving the saga into dance, film, and interactive exhibits. Each context, clinical, cultural, technological, has added depth to the realization that purity of blood is an illusion, while diversity is the bedrock of health and innovation. Now, as museum visitors toggle between gilded funerary art and genome browsers, as students pass the nuance of terms once rendered simply pure, and as communities from Cairo to Mumbai integrate ancient herbal wisdom with gene editing safeguards, the legacy of Egypt's divine rulers lives on in our collective decisions. It shapes reproductive ethics, informs conservation strategies, and reframes identity as a mosaic rather than a monolith. In closing, we return to the image of the Nile, an ever-flowing ribbon of renewal that sustained empires and now sustains data streams, laboratories, and classrooms alike. Just as the river merges countless tributaries into a single current, so too does our shared history unite diverse experiences into a coherent narrative of adaptation. The monuments of stone may endure, but the living tapestry of genes, cultures, and ideas flows onward, enriched by every confluence. May this story remind us that true strength emerges not from isolating a lineage, but from embracing its variations. By honoring both the wisdom of ancient healers and the rigor of modern scientists, by blending ritual and research, and by celebrating the intricate dance of difference, we secure a future as vibrant and enduring as Egypt's timeless monuments, rooted not in purity, but in the resilient power of diversity. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more stories.